Today, most people, and especially people that travel often, cannot imagine a world without airplanes. They cannot imagine that it was once impossible to travel across the world in less than a day. Before planes, the journey across the Atlantic Ocean took over 3 days. Now it can be achieved in about 8 hours or less. That means you could get up at 8 a.m. in London, hop on a flight, and be in New York by 4 p.m. Planes were invented by Wright brothers in 1903, and their development rapidly followed in the years that followed. They were utilized in World War I near the end and on a much larger scale in World War II and the wars that followed. Airplanes have become an integral part of shipping, transportation, and warfare. It has allowed for cargo and people to be moved at hundreds of miles per hour over obstacles such as mountains and rivers that would hinder other forms of transportation, and basically made the world a smaller place. They brought people together from different cultures and countries, accelerated the process of globalization, and laid the foundation for future advances in technology, such as rockets and space shuttles. The effects of airplanes in warfare is probably one of the largest ever by a single invention. It gave an aerial view on an enemy's troops and supplies and allowed for strategic bombing missions, such as those on the Japanese and German cities during World War II. Planes could supply troops, equipment, and weapons to the front lines at a moment's notice, allowing for war to be fought in another dimension. Okay, so now that we know a bit about how planes affected the world, let's imagine how the world would look like had planes not been invented. So this scenario can be explained perhaps by saying that the Wright brothers maybe decided to give up their plans of flying, or failed so horribly that they stopped completely. However, this would still eliminate the possibility that someone else would invent the airplane. Allegedly, a farmer from New Zealand flew an airplane for over 350 yards in a monoplane in March of 1902, before the flight of the Wright brothers. Also, according to some, 3 years after the flight of the Wright brothers, Alberto Santos Dumont flew an independently designed heavier-than-air craft, and in his native Brazil, some even argued that he preceded the Wright brothers. So, we would have to remove all of the potential inventors of the airplane from the time stream, or assume that they all failed in their designs. How would the world look like if that was the case? This scenario is a bit unlikely, but for a second assume that airplanes are never invented. They are never used in World War I, never used in any of the wars that follow, nor used for passenger transportation as well. In this timeline, boats, trains, and cars will be the main form of transportation. Boats would essentially be the only way to traverse oceans and would take much longer than airplanes. It would take at least 45 days and likely more to complete a full trip around the world in this timeline, compared to like maybe 67 hours in our timeline. So in that case, people will be more likely to stay in their homes and not venture far from when they were born, as for centuries. Sure, they must traverse their continents and such, but most people wouldn't see cultures on the opposite side of the world, and only people with the wealth and time to do so would do so. This means that globalization will never take place. The world remains a big place, and people continue to speculate about exotic and distant lands that they most likely will never see. In this timeline, people will also be less understanding of other cultures, as having never seen them assumed them to be too different to be compatible with their society. So, with pockets of the world remaining isolated from one another, and goods and ideas traveling at a much lower rate, how would the state of warfare be affected? War in the 20th century and beyond was essentially defined by airplanes. Without airplanes, war is fought by armies and navies, and there is no air force. Armies still rely on scouts to search enemy positions, and they lose a crucial component provided by planes, aerial views. World War I would be much more chaotic for this reason, as planes provided generals with reconnaissance, with their men bogged down in trenches and a no man's land in between. No traditional scouts could recon the enemy. Thus, without any intelligence, generals would be fighting blind for the most part. Also, armies and troops would be advancing at a much lower rate. Without planes to supply troops at a fast rate, fast attacks as the German Blitzkrieg or World War II would never happen. War would be fought on smaller distances, not across hundreds of miles as in the Second World War. So, in World War II, the Germans could never take down as many countries by surprise as they did in our timeline, and we will probably see a more deadly version of World War I with an eventual stalemate. The Blitz will never happen. The bombing campaigns over Germany and Britain will never occur. The Allied forces couldn't send paratroopers if there were to be a D-Day, and none of the carrier wars of the Pacific will be fought. On the note of the Pacific theater, Pearl Harbor would never happen, as the Japanese would have no way to attack from such great distances across the ocean without airplanes. I won't get into the specifics of what would happen if Pearl Harbor never had happened and U.S. never entered the war, but to sum things up, without planes, the modern world would be very different. Is it possible that the intercontinental missile system would exist? Perhaps, although the technology and experience gained from developing airplanes are crucial in developing other air-based craft. Wars in the 20th century will be actually on a less devastating scale than in our timeline. Imagine the Vietnam War, for example, without planes, without the continuous carpet bombing and napalm attacks on the U.S. conducted with planes. Numerous civilians and Viet Cong would survive. The war might be more devastating for the Americans, but overall the Vietnamese would suffer less casualties. Overall, troop movements would be slowed, intelligence and spying would be radically diminished. For example, we wouldn't even be able to know that there was a Cuban missiles in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and world affairs would be slowed as well. Warfare in this timeline would be more primitive and medieval, without the large-scale bombing attacks and such that we see in our timeline. Instead, troops would fight one another with larger armies and navies, using mainly artillery and guns to fight. Since we have discussed the possible ramifications in warfare, let's discuss travel and technology. As discussed before, travel would take much longer and less people will be able to travel across the world. Thus, businesses and corporations remain local, and people buy foods from their area. The airplane industry simply will not exist and will result in larger ocean liner industries. Technology in this time would actually be decades behind ours, since airplanes provided us with a way to test how humans could survive in the high atmosphere as well as developed air technology. Without airplanes, there will be little to no space industries. Space exploration, if it ever happened, would be severely hampered, and the landing on the moon would take place only decades in the future if it ever happened. The aircraft industry was what paved the way for space testing and technology, with the first rockets incorporating parts of airplanes. Without airplane technology, rockets would have to be developed independently, and since the atmosphere would be much more foreign to us, testing would take longer. Thus, space exploration would decrease. Also, as some of you might be thinking, 9/11 would obviously not happen without planes. There will be many resulting ramifications of that, but let's save that for another video.